Okay, welcome back, everyone. So last session, we were talking about biological theories explaining criminal behavior, factors that can impact fetal development, particularly that might impact the development of the brain, therefore impairing executive functions that might make it more likely one commits a crime. Particularly the part of the brain we were looking at was the thickness of the prefrontal cortex, right, which seemed to be impacted by a number of environmental toxins. I just have a bit more to say on the neuropsychological perspective. We'll talk about some hormones and neurotransmitters, and then I'll make a start on the next section, which is developmental and learning perspectives on risk factors. So one relevant hormone is testosterone. A number of studies have found that there is a correlation between aggression and testosterone, meaning that the higher the baseline testosterone rates on average, the more likely that person is to have an aggressive personality, to have aggressive behaviors, and that violent, aggressive prisoners have been found to have testosterone baseline rates that are on average higher than the general population. But, these are correlational studies predominantly, okay? And as Adrian Rain points out, aggressive behavior can also increase testosterone levels. So it's not necessarily clear that what we're finding is that, higher testosterone rates from early in life then cause one to be more aggressive, okay, in their adult life or to follow, a more aggressive trajectory. And there are some illustrations of causality to a degree, but mainly from animal studies. In experiments, if animals have a boost of testosterone, they do seem in experimental studies to become more aggressive. If animals are castrated, then again, in experiments and through observations, they lessen in terms of their aggressive behavior. But at least for people, most of the evidence right now is still correlational. One large meta-analysis by Book and colleagues looked at all of the studies done to that point on the issue. And they found indeed there was a relationship between testosterone and aggression on average. But even though it's statistically significant, it's fairly weak. It's about 0.14. Now, this is about equal to the correlation between smoking and cancer. So, it's significant, okay? But it's certainly not explaining all aggressive acts. The strength of the relationship seems to be stronger during adolescence, and then the effects of testosterone reduces as one gets older. Other studies have pointed to the fact that this is maybe helping explain some contributions to violent offending, but in cases of other offenses like sexual offending, there isn't this correlation between testosterone and the acts of the crime. Neurotransmitters then, so chemical messengers in the body, one of which is serotonin. Now, serotonin is the neurotransmitter that dampens negative emotion, okay? So it dampens feelings of depression, anxiety, irritability, okay? If you have high levels of serotonin, you're bothered less, okay, by whatever the provocative stimuli is in your environment, okay? You're less likely to have an emotional reaction to it that's intense. So certainly a number of issues have been observed in those who have low levels of serotonin, a serotonin deficiency, okay, more likely to commit suicide, more likely to have a number of mental pathologies, and indeed also been found to be more likely to commit impulsive violent acts, okay? Again, if you have a serotonin deficiency, right, you're more easily bothered, okay? You have a more intense emotional reaction to things. You're going to be more easily irritated and provoked. In fact, the paper you have that I recommend reading this week by Glenn and Rain points to the fact that out of all of the biological factors to do with hormones and neurotransmitters, serotonin is the one that's most replicated, okay, across studies, the one that seems to be most clearly tied to impulsive violent acts. But indeed, we have to consider the type of crime that we're talking about, right? What we're really talking about here is the more reactive forms of violence, right? I made the distinction last time between more predatory, premeditated crimes, right? And then those that are more in the heat of the moment, that are more reactive. Okay, so the serotonin deficiency is going to be more relevant to those reactive crimes, okay, in which one is responding to, being provoked, whether it's an actual provocation or something that's interpreted as being a provocation. Another neurotransmitter not tied to aggression as much as serotonin, but at least in some studies, is dopamine. Now, dopamine is the neurotransmitter that encourages you to go after what it is that you want, right? That encourages approach behavior. It has you responding to incentives in the environment so that you feel enthusiastic and encouraged. So you're going after what it is that you want. So higher levels of dopamine have, in some cases, been found to enhance aggressive acts, especially when one is under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And this also ties to a particular gene, which is the MAOA gene. Okay. Now, the MAOA gene is the gene that's involved in the reuptake of serotonin and dopamine. And some individuals have a lower activity variant of this gene, okay? Meaning a variant of the gene that's not as active, okay, as it is in a typical person. And this variant on it is sometimes called the warrior gene in pop culture. Called the warrior gene because a number of well-known boxers and other athletes in kind of violent sports have been found to have this gene. But also a number in the criminal population have also been found to have this variant of the gene. So this is tying into the serotonin deficiency, okay, one who has this low activity variance of the gene is going to have a serotonin deficiency. But again, we have to keep in mind the type of violence and also other environmental contributions, because a number of studies more recently have pointed to the fact that if one has this low activity variant, it does not increase their chances of being criminal later in life unless they were also maltreated, okay? If they were physically or sexually abused as children, only then does this gene or this variant of the gene seem to be relevant, okay? So the correlation between being physically or sexually abused and acting criminal later in adulthood is about 0.1. It's a small positive correlation, but if you are abused, you're more likely to commit a crime later in life. This effect is threefolded if one also has the low activity variant of the gene. Okay, so then the correlation is 0.3 between being abused and then committing a crime later on. So some interaction is occurring here, okay, between having this variant of the gene and then a particular environmental experience, okay, that seems to be evoking something from the variant of the gene. But again, it's more tied to these reactive types of crimes, okay, these impulsive acts, okay, particularly in response to social exclusion or provocation, some attack to one's kind of self-esteem or well-being. According to a review by Rain, the association between low levels of the MAOA gene and antisocial personality disorder is one of the most robust findings in all of genetic studies when looking at samples of those who were maltreated or abused early in life. A kind of older theory I want to bring up, because there's been some more recent extensions or moderations on it, is Hans Eysenck's personality theory. Now, Hans Eysenck had a theory of personality that basically there were 3 mega traits, if you like, of personality, or super traits, as he called them. They really could explain pretty much all feelings, thoughts, behaviors, okay, pretty much all personality, according to him, could be traced back to one of these 3 dimensions. So you have extroversion, which is, how lively you are, how sociable you are. But for Eysenck, he's really looking at it in terms of physiological arousal. Okay, so for Eysenck, extroverts are those that have quite low levels of cortical arousal, and so they seek out stimulation in the environment. Okay, because they're sensation seeking because they need a way to increase their cortical arousal because they don't naturally have a great degree of cortical arousal. Whereas introverts are the opposite. There are those who are overwhelmed by so much cortical arousal already that they don't seek out stimulation from the outside world because that would be too much. That would be overstimulating them. The second one is neuroticism. So your propensity for negative emotion is usually how it's characterized. But again, Eysenck's looking at it in terms of physiological arousal. So those who are high in neuroticism are those who have a very reactive atomic nervous system, okay, to stress in their life, okay? So it takes quite a minimal amount of stress for them to have a pretty severe reaction to it, okay, and to feel overwhelmed. Whereas those who are low in neuroticism, who we would class as emotionally stable, they have a unreactive atomic nervous system, or comparatively so, okay? So it takes a lot more for them to feel rattled and stressed, okay? They're much more resilient, if you like, to stresses in the environment. Okay. And then psychotism, which is really about your degree of selfishness, okay? Low agreeableness, being self-centered. So for Eysenck, you know, most personality traits pretty much can be subsumed somewhere within one of these three dimensions. And because of his ideas on arousal, he believed that the way in which you condition growing up has quite a lot to do with your propensity for committing crimes. So extroverts, they're seeking stimulation, they condition poorly, they're more impulsive. Introverts avoid stimulation, condition quite easily, are quiet, reserved. Neurotics have an atomic nervous system, pretty overreactive, anxious behaviors, they condition poorly. And then those who are emotionally stable condition well, even-tempered, under stress. So putting that together, according to Eysenck, stable introverts are those that condition best, and then neurotic extroverts are those that condition least well. So for Eysenck, the neurotic extroverts are the ones most likely to commit crimes, okay, based upon these ideas. So his theory was that those high in extroversion and those high in neuroticism would be overrepresented in the criminal population. A number of studies have found that this isn't really exactly the case, okay? Extroversion doesn't really seem to correlate with general offending. Some evidence for neuroticism that criminals on average are maybe slightly higher in neuroticism than average. Later in the course, we'll talk about psychopaths, okay, those with extreme personality disorders who repeatedly reoffend, okay. We find that there's more tie-in here, okay, but it's not really like Eysenck predicted. Psychopaths are actually higher in extroversion, yes, but actually lower in neuroticism than the general public. So overall, there wasn't a great degree of support for Eysenck's basic ideas, but some theories emerged after his publications, okay, adapting the ideas or moderating them. So one explanation is the under-arousal hypothesis, congruent with the sensation-seeking hypothesis. Both theories arose independently, but they're basically overlapping in terms of what they're claiming. But this argues that those who have chronically low levels of arousal are more likely to commit crimes because they're more stimulation seeking, because it's an uncomfortable way to be, to have this low level of arousal. You know, and you can relate to the fact, I would imagine, that there's an optimal level of arousal, right? Sometimes you're feeling a bit too drowsy and not aroused enough, and maybe you want a bit of caffeine to give you a pickup. Maybe sometimes you're feeling a bit too overstimulated and a bit too aroused, and so you want to kind of retreat and have some time to yourself to recharge, right? So there is a degree of optimal arousal. So the idea here is those that are chronically under aroused, okay, permanently not having much physiological reactions to things, okay, because this is such an uncomfortable state to be in, they're constantly looking for ways to increase their arousal through, thrill-seeking activities, sensation-seeking activities, explaining why those with antisocial personality disorder are more likely to drive in a way that's unsafe, more likely to have gambling issues, more likely also to maybe seek stimulation through drugs and through alcohol, substance abuses. But also those with antisocial personality disorder are very impulsive, restless, do seem to get bored very easily. And they do engage in a number of risk-seeking behaviors, not just those related to criminal offenses. So that's kind of one area of theories that have emerged from Eysenck's ideas. Another that I'll come back to is the fearlessness hypothesis, but that's really tying in with these findings to do with low resting heart rates. So a number of studies have found that those with low resting heart rates are more likely to commit criminal offenses. Okay, one meta-analysis, low resting heart rates was the best replicated biological predictor of antisocial behavior in children, adolescents, and then also strong findings in meta-analysis for adults as well. Interestingly, the correlation has also been found in animals in various species, various small mammals. Those with lower resting heart rates more likely to display predatory aggression. Okay. The association is true even when controlling for a number of potential confounds, such as age, a number of potential health diseases or health issues, how much one exercises. Okay, so these potential confounds, when controlled, the association is still true. So, looking at why this might be, if I was to think about, committing a robbery, for example, as I, approach the store to do so, I would experience an increase in heart rates, right? So that would be uncomfortable because it comes with it a number of other, physiological effects, right? I would get lightheaded and I would have an impact on my breathing and so on. And so that might deter me, right, from going through with this crime, okay, because I'm having a physiological reaction to the idea of doing this. So the fearlessness hypothesis is that those with this blunted atomic stress response are more likely to go through with committing offenses, okay, because they're less likely to have this biological deterrence, if you like, okay, they're less likely to have this reaction that in most people would deter them from going through with it. Also, why they're more likely to get into confrontations, why they're more likely to get into fights, okay? Because again, they're not having this kind of anxiety, okay, in response to the idea of going through with it. So this raises a question, right? We've got two different angles on the issue. Is crime being committed because one is under aroused, or are they being committed because one is fearless? The somatic marker hypothesis is really more to explain psychopathic behavior, because what we'll find when we talk about psychopathy later in the course is that psychopaths don't really have bodily responses, okay, to what they're doing. They don't have these physical reactions. They don't have a sense of fear, a sense of anxiety, a sense of shame, okay, that for most people would have an influence on their behavior. So this is congruent with the fearlessness hypothesis, right? But it's not as simple as one of these explaining all crimes, of course, right? What's more likely to be the case is that in some cases, the stimulation-seeking hypothesis will be more relevant, and in some cases, the fearlessness hypothesis will be more relevant, okay? Especially when we're talking about more psychopathic individuals who do have a substantially lower resting heart rates in response to stresses, okay, than the general public. Is there any questions on anything I've covered there? Yeah, I want to just give you a couple of concrete examples of some of the things I've talked about last time and today. this is the case of Michael, or Mr. Oft. He's at the time about 40 years old. He's a school teacher. He's in his second marriage. The woman he's married to has already has a child from a previous relationship, and they've been together for, well, they've been married for 5 years. So he became a stepfather to this young girl when she was 7, and at this time she's 12 years old. So he's been basically her father for the last 5 years. And those who knew him would say he was a very mild-mannered, patient person, never prone to aggression at all. Okay, not very argumentative, quite a very patient, by all accounts, a nice-seeming person. He would sing a lullaby or tell a bedtime story to his stepdaughter whenever he would take her to bed. And then what began to happen was there was an increasing amount of improper behavior. Okay, he would begin to get into bed next to her when telling these stories, and then he would begin touching her, and then this increased to him then fondling her in a way that was completely inappropriate. This was obviously confusing for her. This was her stepfather. She loved him, and she was sure that he loved her. But eventually, when it began to get really inappropriate, she spoke to her mother about it. Her mother then looked at Michael's internet history, okay, found what's called barely legal porn, okay, which is porn that's technically illegal, but it's actors who look much, much younger than they are, so it looks like children. And so she then reported to the police, okay, what Michael had been doing to her stepdaughter. He was charged with sexual assault, and he was given a choice, okay, either complete a sexual offending program or go to prison. So probably like most people would, he opted for the sexual offending program, okay. But then he propositioned the woman who was running the program for sex and failed the program, okay. Pretty obvious way to fail it. So then he's having to serve this prison sentence. And the day before he's due to start the sentence, he wants to check himself into hospital, complaining about very severe headaches, okay. The psychiatric hospital, typically they'll only keep someone there if they're a danger to themselves or others. They're not going to keep him there just for these headaches. So he then says he's going to kill himself if they don't keep him there. They're still not that sure that he's being serious. So then he says, well, if you don't take me in, I'm going to go back and rape my landlady. So then they decide, right, well, keep him in the psychiatric hospital. And they list the reason as pedophilia. And then once he's in this hospital, the headaches persist in terms of how terrible they are. But more than that, he seems to have no sense of shame whatsoever. He's propositioning the women who work there for sex. He urinates where he's standing, doesn't seem to really care about any potential embarrassment. And so one of the doctors gets the idea to scan his brain. And what they find is a very, very large tumor on his frontal lobe, pushing down on his prefrontal cortex. The tumor is removed, and he claims that he has this sense of shame again over what it is that he's done. He's terribly embarrassed. He feels as though he's done something horrible, of course, to his family. He no longer has these sexual deviant fantasies that he had before. He goes back into the sexual offending program, this time completes it, no issues. And his wife takes him back, and for a period of time, they seem to go back to normal. And then his behavior begins changing again. Again, he seems to become a bit more reckless, impulsive, aggressive. She looks up again his internet history, and sure enough, again, he's been looking at barely legal porn. This time, he goes back to the doctors. He gets another brain scan. Sure enough, the brain tumor has returned. Okay. He gets the brain tumor removed a second time, and then for a second time, he seems to go back to this normal person without these sexual deviant fantasies. And his wife doesn't take him back this time. That's the end of the relationship. But as far as I know, since the second time the tumor was removed, there's been no re-signs over any deviant fantasies or criminal behavior or anything such as that. So this is one example similar to the Phineas Gage example of causality, right? Or at least as close as we can get when it's something that's usually measured in correlational studies. Someone who's behavior did seem to severely change, okay, as a consequence of this large tumor on this particular part of his brain. There's some questions we might want to ask, like I say, as we go through this, consider what the implications are for, the legal system and so on. Do you think Michael's responsible for his behavior? Technically, according to the law, yes, he is. He knew what he was doing, okay? And he knew what he was doing was insane. He knew what he was doing was wrong, okay? He knew it was wrong to touch his stepdaughter in the way that he was. He knew it was wrong to look at the material that he was looking up. He describes himself afterwards as a kind of small voice at the back of his head that was telling him, don't do this, this is wrong, okay? But it was completely drowned out by this much larger voice at the front of his head that was telling him to just do whatever he wants, okay? To just follow every single urge that he had. So is it just to punish Michael? Again, this is a question you can ask yourself, right? Or maybe, is it just to punish him in the same way as someone who doesn't have a tumor and makes the same actions? Yeah. When he had the tumor, he knew that what he was doing was illegal. He wasn't insane. He understood what the law was, and he knew he was breaking the law. But he didn't have this kind of sense of shame or this sense of guilt when he was doing it. Yeah. Anything else? I'll give you another example of how some of what we're talking about has already had implications in the legal system. This is Peyton Tuthill. She had just graduated from the College of Charleston, moved to Denver. She was looking to do some work helping others. Particularly, she was interested in helping those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Her sorority in college had been involved in helping orphans get adopted. Someone who had a very bright future ahead of her, okay, but shortly after moving to Denver, Donta Page broke into her house, robbed her house, and then raped her and violently murdered her, okay? It was a very violent, graphic crime, okay? The details given to the jury. The jury found Donta Page guilty, and then he was facing the death penalty. But in the state of Colorado, when one is facing the death penalty, they go before a panel of judges, and the judges decide whether the individual gets the death penalty or whether they get life in prison instead. And so Donta Page's defense attorneys were looking for any possible mitigating circumstances, anything that might lessen his responsibility. There's a number of things, a terrible, terrible upbringing, but one of which they found, which is relevant to what we're talking about, was his activity in the prefrontal cortex. So just like the study I showed you last time, okay, we have normal controls who are undergoing a cognitive task, and we see the frontal lobe becoming more active, more blood flow to this area of the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, as we would expect during this cognitive task, right? This is the part of the brain that's involved in cognitive skills, executive functions. But if you compare it to Donta Page's brain, it's not becoming active, okay? There isn't good blood flow during this cognitive task, implicating or indicating that there isn't good activity in the prefrontal cortex, okay? In this case, Donta Page was spared the death penalty. He's still given life in prison, so he'll never be released, okay? But the argument here is that because of this brain dysfunction, he's less responsible than someone with a typical brain, okay? And so it's diminished responsibility, okay? Which doesn't mean you're not guilty, okay? It just means the punishment's less severe than if someone has full responsibility. But the vast majority of these sorts of arguments are denied, okay? About 3/4 of them are unsuccessful. The standard is very high, as it should be, in terms of persuading courts that one has diminished responsibility based upon biological evidence. So in one case, for example, the defense claimed that the defendant who had committed violent a violent homicide, had done so because of a serotonin deficiency. Furthermore, they argued that serotonin deficiency is actually one of the deficiencies that we can address, right? We can give someone serotonin reuptake inhibitors to address the fact that they have a serotonin deficiency. Unlike in the previous case, there's not really anything that can be done for a prefrontal cortex dysfunction. But the appellate court was not convinced, okay, and so the death penalty went ahead, and this defendant was executed by lethal injection. It was re-argued and again rejected. Okay, so like I say, it's a controversial issue. Most of the cases are denied, and I imagine people will have different opinions. And certainly different states have different opinions. Okay, the state of Michigan has ruled that no biological evidence can be put forward to argue for diminished responsibility under any circumstances. Now, there's a number of caveats to what I'm talking about, okay? All of what I'm talking about is a predisposition only. It's not an example of causality, right? So, I talked about the fact that the prefrontal cortex is kind of described as the brakes on a car or the angel on your shoulder, right? When you want to go through with a particular impulse, it's the part of the brain that lights up and says, don't do this, okay? Because this is what the consequences will be. But for those who have a inactive prefrontal cortex, or this part of the brain at least isn't as functional, this isn't going to kick in the same way, right? And stop them from going ahead with the impulse. Similar to how Mr. Oft described the situation, but actually Dante Page describes the situation similarly. He again said that there was a small voice at the back of his head telling him this is wrong, but there was a much larger voice at the front of his head that is telling him just follow your urges, just do what you want to do. Kind of like someone who's ruled by their aids, as Freud would have said, okay, who's not thinking about the well-being of others or the consequences of their actions, okay, who's just listening to more animalistic drives. There's no one-to-one relationship with anything I've discussed, and biology does not negate the social. The environmental situations are still important. About 50% of the variance is explained by the environment, about 50% by biology in terms of the differences in crime and antisocial behavior. But also, the environment might evoke some factors to the surface, or it might overwrite some predispositions as well, okay? And none of these biomarkers are diagnostic. In fact, pretty much all of them are also markers of other mental disorders, okay? With the exception of low resting heart rates, which is something that's very unique about it, okay? Prefrontal cortex dysfunction, for example, is also a risk factor for a number of other mental disorders to do with impaired executive functions. Low resting heart rate is unique in that it's not a symptom or a marker of any other mental disorder other than antisocial personality disorder / psychopathy. So again, think of the wider implications of what I'm talking about. Should we use biological risk factors to identify those who may be predisposed to violence? Or is there a danger of relying too much on neuroscientific evidence? If you've seen the Crime Minority Report, you might know what I'm talking about, right? In which people are treated harshly before they've even committed a crime, okay, because of this detection. Sometimes when we think about free will or responsibility, we think about it in terms that are, black and white. You either have free will or you don't. But maybe it's more like a dimension or a continuum, okay, that some people have more free will than others, okay? There's always a degree of free will. That some people are more constrained, okay, by some biological factors or some environmental factors. And if we do accept that there are some constraints on free will, then should that come into account when making decisions on punishment?